In the fall of 1977, the town of Millfield, Ohio, was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. The streets emptied early, the nights fell quiet, and most people knew everyone by name. But that calm was broken one cold October evening when 22-year-old Lynn Carter, one of the few women training to become a police officer in the county, vanished without a trace. Lynn wasn't just another cadet at the Millfield Police Academy. She was the top of her class, disciplined, sharp, and driven by something deeper than ambition. Her father had served in law enforcement before his passing, and those who knew her said she wanted to make him proud. She had a habit of staying late after drills, polishing her boots until they gleamed, making sure her uniform looked perfect. To her, the academy wasn't just a step toward a career. It was a promise she intended to keep. That Friday had started like any other. Training ended around dusk, and the cadets filed out of the gym, exhausted and soaked in sweat. The air outside was heavy, the sky swollen with dark clouds that promised a storm. According to her roommate, Lynn lingered behind to clean up the locker room, saying she'd catch up later. She slipped on her academy-issued rain jacket, tucked a folder under her arm, and started walking the half-mile back to the dorms. It was a quiet stretch, a gravel road lined with bare trees and utility poles. There were no sidewalks, no streetlights, just the occasional flicker of headlights from cars heading into town. At around 7:15 p.m., a cadet named Paul Turner passed her in his car. He later told police she was walking with her head down, hands stuffed in her jacket pockets, rain already falling in sheets. He remembered thinking she looked cold, but she was less than 10 minutes from the dorm. He assumed she'd make it back fine. That was the last confirmed sighting of Lynn Carter alive. When her roommate Karen woke up the next morning and saw Lynn's bed still made, she thought maybe she'd left early for weekend drills. But by noon, when no one had seen or heard from her, she began to worry. Karen reported it to the academy's front office. Within hours, word spread across the small campus. A cadet was missing. At first, no one panicked. The academy's chief instructor, Lieutenant Graves, assured everyone it was probably a misunderstanding. She's an adult, he told reporters later. Maybe she needed a break. Maybe she went home. But when they called her mother, Mrs. Carter, in Columbus, she said Lynn hadn't come home. She hadn't even called. And that, she said, was impossible. Her daughter called every Sunday, no matter how tired she was. By that evening, officers began retracing Lynn's last known steps. They found her locker still neatly arranged, her duffel bag untouched. Her car was parked in the same spot outside the dorm, locked, with her purse and keys inside. Her paycheck, due that week, was still uncollected. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the road, just rainwater washing everything clean. The storm that night had been brutal. Winds up to 40 miles per hour, sheets of rain, and scattered power outages across the county. If something had happened to Lynn along that road, if someone had stopped, or if she'd fallen or run into trouble, the evidence might have been erased within minutes. Detectives interviewed cadets, instructors, and locals. Some said they saw a dark blue pickup truck parked near the training field that evening, headlights off. Others mentioned hearing a shout near the woods, but they couldn't tell if it was human or just the wind. Every account contradicted the next. Within 48 hours, the official search began. Officers on horseback, dogs combing the forest, volunteers walking shoulder to shoulder through muddy fields. They found nothing. Rumors began to spread through the academy. Some whispered that she'd been secretly dating one of the instructors, a married man. Others said she'd been planning to drop out after a series of heated arguments with her fiancé, a mechanic named Daniel Reeves. He was questioned, of course. He said they had argued days earlier, yes, about her future, about how dangerous police work was for women, but he swore he hadn't seen her that night. His alibi checked out. Despite that, investigators grew suspicious. They began to treat the case less like a disappearance and more like a runaway. Stress, they wrote in their early notes, could be a factor. It was the late 1970s, and women in uniform still faced scrutiny. A few officers openly doubted her. They said she cracked under pressure, that she'd walked away. But Lynn's mother refused to believe that. She drove to Millfield herself, standing in front of the academy gates every morning, handing out flyers with her daughter's photo. A soft-faced woman with tired eyes, she told every reporter who would listen, Lynn would never leave without saying goodbye. Something happened to her out there. Weeks passed. The leaves fell. Snow followed. And still, there was no trace, Until one frigid morning in December, when a groundskeeper at the town's riverside park made a strange discovery. On a wooden bench near the old walking trail sat a folded police academy rain jacket, soaked through from the night's frost. Inside the pocket was a single laminated photo, a class portrait of Lynn and her fellow cadets. When police examined it, they confirmed it was her jacket, her name stitched neatly inside the collar. But there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, nothing to suggest she'd been there herself. It was as if someone had placed it there intentionally. For investigators, it raised more questions than answers. Why fold it so neatly? Why leave it somewhere public weeks after she vanished? Was it a message? A taunt? Or something else, a quiet attempt to make her disappear completely, to make it seem like she had walked away by choice? By Christmas, the official search was suspended. The file remained open, but resources dried up. The academy tried to move on, scheduling new cadet intakes and clearing out old lockers. Yet, some said the dorm never felt the same. Cadets claimed they'd see her nameplate still on the door, her shoes still under the bed. A few swore they could still hear faint footsteps in the hall late at night, the echo of a woman who never made it home. In Millfield, time moved forward, but the story of the missing cadet lingered like a stain. People avoided that gravel road after dark. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone. And Lynn's mother, she never stopped searching. For her, there was only one question that mattered. If her daughter didn't leave on her own, then who made her disappear? And what happened in those final minutes on that stormy road between the academy lights and the dorms? A stretch of darkness where Lynn Carter simply vanished from the world. By the fourth day of Lynn Carter's disappearance, Millfield no longer felt like the quiet Ohio town it used to be. Police cruisers lined the narrow roads around the academy, and volunteers trudged through the fields with flashlights, calling her name into the cold air. What began as confusion had turned into something darker, a growing fear that whatever happened to Lynn wasn't just an accident. The official search started on a Tuesday morning. The rain from the previous week had left the ground soaked and soft, the kind of mud that swallowed footprint whole. Detectives set up a command post at the academy gymnasium. Maps were spread across tables, red circles drawn around wooded areas, trails, and drainage ditches. Helicopters swept overhead, and divers were sent to check the nearby quarry. On the surface, it looked thorough, methodical. But for those closest to Lynn, it already felt too late. Cadets volunteered to join the search. They trudged shoulder to shoulder through the thickets behind the dorms, some of them crying quietly as they walked. Many of them blamed themselves. One said he meant to offer Lynn a ride that night, but didn't want to seem overprotective. Another admitted he'd seen a car idling near the old tool shed but thought nothing of it. Everyone had a fragment of the truth, but none of it fit together. The investigation quickly grew complicated. Witness statements clashed, timelines blurred, and the rain had washed away almost everything that could have been useful. A local farmer told deputies he saw a blue pickup parked on the gravel road around 7:30, about the same time Lynn would have been walking back to her dorm. He said he saw someone standing beside it, a man, but couldn't describe his face. Another witness, a jogger from town, insisted she saw Lynn walking toward the forest trail that cut behind the academy, alone and in the rain. Both statements were taken seriously, but they pointed in completely different directions. Detectives worked long nights, chasing every tip. They searched the pickup's registration records, questioned local mechanics, even set up roadblocks for a week hoping the driver might pass through again. Nothing. When they checked the forest trail, they found only animal tracks and puddles. At the riverbank a half-mile away, a deputy noticed a single muddy boot print in the clay. It matched Lynn's shoe size, but there was no second print beside it, just one half-smeared and disappearing into the mud. It could have been hers. It could have been anyone's. Inside the academy, morale collapsed. Cadets whispered in the hallways, avoiding empty dorm rooms and late-night drills. Every locker inspection, every uniform check felt different now. The instructors tried to keep things professional, but their voices carried an unease they couldn't hide. Some said the academy's leadership wasn't doing enough. Others said they were doing too much, scrambling to protect their own reputation. Within a week, the town was divided between hope and suspicion. Rumors spread faster than the search reports. Some said Lynn had been seen arguing with her fiancé days before she vanished. Others claimed a local deputy, one who trained at the academy years earlier, had been infatuated with her, showing up during drills when he wasn't assigned there. Police questioned him, but his alibi checked out. He said he'd been on patrol 2 towns over that night. The chief publicly cleared him, but people kept whispering his name anyway. Lynn's mother refused to stay silent. She stood outside the academy gates every morning, holding her daughter's photo, begging for information. News stations came and went, filming short segments about the missing cadet. The town's diners started collecting donations for search efforts. But as the days turned into weeks, the cameras disappeared, and so did most of the volunteers. The sheriff's department poured through every inch of Lynn's life. They searched her dorm, her journals, her letters. They found no signs of depression, no farewell notes, no indication she'd planned to leave. The only odd thing they found was a letter draft tucked inside her desk. Never mailed, addressed to someone named C.W. It was short and vague, a note about needing to talk privately and things going too far. Investigators couldn't determine who C.W. was, and without context, it meant little. But in hindsight, it would become one of the most important clues they overlooked. As fall turned into winter, the tone of the investigation changed. The media stopped covering it. The academy resumed classes. New cadets arrived, filling hallways with unfamiliar faces. For the few who'd known Lynn, it felt wrong, like she'd been erased before anyone truly understood what had happened. By late November, search efforts slowed. The sheriff announced that all major search zones had been covered twice, and that without new leads, the investigation would be scaled back. For Lynn's family, it was unbearable. Her mother drove to the sheriff's office every week, demanding updates, asking for new interviews, begging for someone to keep looking. Detectives listened but had nothing new to tell her. In one of the final searches before winter, a group of volunteers combed the riverbank again. This time they found something small, a fragment of fabric tangled in a tree root, faded blue, like part of a uniform. Forensic testing later confirmed it was too degraded to match anything conclusively. The press called it a possible clue. The sheriff's department called it inconclusive. To her family, it was just another piece of something they couldn't understand. As December arrived, the investigation quietly lost momentum. The file on Lynn Carter's disappearance grew thicker, but not with answers. Only interviews, witness contradictions, and reports that led nowhere. Officers started transferring to new assignments. The lead detective, after months of frustration, described it bluntly. There's no evidence of foul play and no proof of voluntary disappearance. The case was left in limbo. Lynn's parents pleaded with national outlets, Dateline, America's Most Wanted, but none picked up the story. A missing cadet from a small-town academy didn't draw headlines anymore. By January, her case file was marked inactive. Internally, the sheriff's office labeled it missing, presumed dead. In Millfield, people began to move on. The academy painted over the flyers on its bulletin board. The river froze. The bench where her jacket had been found sat buried in snow. But for those who'd searched for her, especially her fellow cadets, the guilt never faded. Many of them remembered her walking in that rain, a determined young woman chasing a dream in a place that wasn't ready for her. They'd replayed that night in their minds 1,000 times, asking the same question. If someone had offered her a ride, would she still be alive? The silence that followed her disappearance became part of the town itself. People avoided mentioning her name in public, as if doing so might reopen something everyone wanted to forget. But beneath that silence, suspicion lingered. Some believed she'd been murdered and covered up. Others thought she'd simply walked away, that maybe the pressure finally broke her. The truth was, no one knew. And in that uncertainty, the story of Lynn Carter began to fade, not because people stopped caring, but because the trail itself had vanished. Still, every now and then, someone driving that road at night would slow down, glance toward the empty woods, and wonder if she was still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. By the early 1980s, the story of Lynn Carter had all but faded from public memory. Her photo, once taped to every storefront window and telephone pole in Millfield, had curled and yellowed in the weather, the ink bleeding until her smile was nothing more than a shadow. For most, she had become one more name in a long list of cold cases the town tried not to talk about. But for those who still remembered, silence didn't bring peace. It brought questions that refused to go away. Inside the sheriff's department, her case file sat buried in the back of a metal cabinet, its label nearly worn off. The pages were soft with age, stained by coffee and rainwater. The evidence bags, if you could still call them that, contained little more than scraps, a few reports, photographs of footprints that led nowhere, and the blurry image of her academy portrait. Over the years, detectives came and went. Some took a glance at her file, shook their heads, and pushed it back where they'd found it. There was never anything new to add, and every attempt to revisit it ended in the same way: a sigh, a shrug, and the quiet closing of a drawer. It was during this time that Harold Sloan, one of the Academy's retired instructors, began speaking about something he'd never mentioned before. In the fall of 1977, the night Lynn vanished, he had been driving home late from the Academy. The rain was heavy, and visibility was low, but as he passed the fields north of the training grounds, he remembered seeing a faint orange light flickering through the trees. At first, he thought it was a tractor or someone burning brush, but when he slowed down, it looked different, smaller, more contained, like a lantern hanging inside a barn. He didn't stop. It was late, and in his mind, there was no reason to. But after hearing about Lynn's disappearance the next day, he couldn't shake the image. For years, that memory stayed buried with everything else. He finally mentioned it in an interview with a young reporter from a local paper in 1983. The article was small, tucked between stories about factory layoffs and a county fair, but it caught the attention of one detective who brought the detail up in a department meeting. They drove out to the area described by Sloan, a stretch of old farmland that had been sold off in the early 1980s, but found nothing but an overgrown field and the skeletal remains of a collapsed structure. There was no evidence to tie it to Lynn, and without cause to dig or test the site, the note about the barn light was simply added to her file and forgotten again. Years blurred together. Lynn's parents aged quietly, still living in the same small house in Columbus where her childhood photos line the hallway. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, her mother mailed a letter to the sheriff's office asking for updates. Most years, she got no reply. The few that came back were short and polite, saying there were no new developments. Her father stopped opening the mail altogether. By 1988, they were both gone, her mother from cancer, her father 6 months later. Neither of them ever learned what happened to their daughter. The case might have stayed buried for good if not for something that happened hundreds of miles away. In the summer of 1990, a female cadet named Dana Heller disappeared from a police academy in neighboring Indiana. Like Lynn, she was young, ambitious, and one of the few women in her class. Her body was never found, but her car was discovered near an abandoned training barn, once used for tactical drills. When news of that case broke, one of Millfield's detectives noticed the eerie similarity. For the first time in over a decade, Lynn Carter's file was pulled from storage. A newly formed cold case unit took interest. They compared the two disappearances side by side: the geography, the training routines, even the academy layouts. Both women had vanished after evening drills. Both were last seen walking near barns used for scenario exercises. And in both cases, the departments involved had quietly moved on after a short investigation. It was the kind of pattern detectives couldn't ignore, even if it was only circumstantial. For months, they worked through old files, re-interviewing anyone still alive from Lynn's academy days. They found that one of the training barns used in 1977 had belonged to a former deputy named Charles Weller, a man who'd left the department shortly after her disappearance. Weller had since moved out of state, living under the radar in Kentucky. Investigators reached out, but by the time they located him, he died of a heart attack years earlier. With no living suspect and no physical evidence, the lead evaporated. Still, one small thing stood out in the cold case review: an overlooked note from the original investigation mentioning a restricted barn used for private remedial training sessions. The document didn't specify who supervised those sessions, only that they were conducted off-campus for behavioral evaluation. It was a vague, bureaucratic way of describing something that clearly fell outside official policy. The cold case team tried to find any record of these sessions, rosters, reports, anything, but nearly all academy archives from the late 70s had been destroyed in a storage flood years earlier. The more the investigators searched, the more it felt like they were chasing ghosts. Every potential clue had been erased by time, washed away, misplaced, or forgotten. The people who might have known something were gone, and those still around had memories that blurred or contradicted each other. One retired officer swore Lynn had once confided that she was being harassed by someone on staff, but when pressed for names, he said he couldn't remember. Another said she'd been planning to quit, that she'd been under too much pressure. No one could agree on what was true anymore. By the end of 1990, the cold case review was quietly suspended. Officially, there was no evidence linking Lynn's disappearance to the newer case, and no proof of foul play that could hold up in court. Her file was reclassified as inactive, unresolved, and sent back to storage once again. As the years turned, so did the dust on the file cabinets. The sheriff who'd signed off on her case retired. The academy expanded its facilities, building new dorms where the old ones once stood. The gravel road Lynn had walked that night was paved over and renamed for a local councilman. Even the field where the barns once stood was fenced off and sold to a private landowner. Every trace of that night, every landmark that could have held a clue, was slowly erased by progress. But there were still a few who remembered. Harold Sloan, now in his 70s, would bring up the story whenever someone mentioned the academy. He'd tell them about the light he saw that night, how it flickered like it was waiting for someone to notice. People would nod politely, listen, and move on. To them, it was just an old man's memory. To him, it was the one thing that had never stopped bothering him. He said he'd driven past that area for years afterward, hoping to see the light again. He never did. By the end of the decade, Lynn Carter's name had become a ghost of local history, a story people only half remembered, the kind told quietly over coffee or mentioned in passing when new cadets arrived. Her case was a reminder of something everyone wished hadn't happened, something that couldn't be fixed. And yet, even in that silence, something about her story refused to disappear completely. The details, the rain, the jacket on the bench, the barn light no one ever checked, lingered like pieces of a puzzle waiting for someone to finally put them together. Because somewhere, buried beneath years of neglect and indifference, the truth about what happened to Lynn Carter was still there, sealed away in the dark, waiting for fire and time to bring it back to the surface. For 25 years, the story of Lynn Carter had faded into the background noise of small-town legend, the kind people only whispered about during storms or long drives past the academy gates. But in the spring of 2002, that quiet ghost of a mystery came roaring back to life in the most violent way imaginable. A thunderstorm rolled through rural Ohio that night, snapping power lines and lighting up the sky in waves of white fire. On the outskirts of town, lightning struck an old wooden barn that had been abandoned for decades. By the time firefighters arrived, the structure was already a tower of flame. They fought the blaze for hours in heavy rain and wind till the roof finally gave way. When the fire was out, only a smoldering skeleton of beams remained. But as dawn broke and the smoke thinned, one firefighter noticed something strange, a shape, half buried in the blackened dirt, pale beneath the ash. At first, they thought it was a mannequin, a training dummy, maybe left behind from some long-forgotten exercise. But when the rainwater began to wash the soot away, the outline became unmistakable. Human bones. And clinging to them, barely holding together, were bits of fabric that still carried faint traces of blue. A uniform. Not military, not modern. The patches were old, almost vintage. The discovery stopped everyone cold. Within hours, police had sealed off the site, and forensic specialists from Columbus were called in. The barn, investigators learned, sat just outside the perimeter of the old police academy's property line, land that had once been leased to a deputy who left the force decades ago. When daylight came and the scene was photographed, the forensic team began their meticulous recovery. Each bone was logged, numbered, and lifted from the ash. Despite the damage, much of the skeleton had been preserved by the dry interior soil beneath the collapsed flooring. Bits of melted polyester were found fused to the remains, the same material used in the cadet uniforms of the 1970s. A cracked metal badge fragment lay nearby, its engraving scorched but still legible enough to show the letters LSAR. It was impossible to ignore what it might mean. After so many years, the name that had haunted the academy halls, the one printed on missing posters, mentioned in cadet folklore, had resurfaced in the most horrifying way. Dental records confirmed it within days. The remains were those of Lynn Carter. The girl who vanished in the rain 25 years earlier had never left the academy grounds. She had been here all along, buried in the darkness less than a mile away. The revelation sent shockwaves through the small community that had long tried to move on. Retired officers who had once dismissed her disappearance as a runaway case were suddenly dragged back into the light. Former cadets, now middle-aged, called each other in disbelief. For the Carter family, what little was left of it, the news was both devastating and numbing. Lynn's parents had died years before, but her younger brother, now in his 40s, flew in from out of state to stand at the edge of that blackened foundation where his sister's story had ended. He told reporters it was both a relief and a nightmare. Relief that she had finally been found, but horror at realizing how close she'd always been. Detectives reopened the case immediately. They began with the property records. The barn had once belonged to a man named Deputy Charles Weller, a former instructor at the academy during the 1970s. His name was one of many that had appeared briefly in the original case file before the investigation went cold. Weller had retired abruptly just weeks after Lynn vanished, citing health issues. He sold his land and left Ohio within the year. No one had ever looked back at him until now. Investigators traced his file and found little. Weller had died in 1989 from a reported heart attack in Tennessee. But as they pieced through what records remained, something unsettling emerged. Back in 1977, Weller had overseen a field training area that included several barns used for tactical drills, the same structures mentioned in the later cold case review from 1990. The one that had burned down in 2002 was one of those barns. It had been part of the same training loop Lynn was last scheduled to run through the night she disappeared. This discovery reignited the entire case. Retired officers were interviewed, some reluctantly. A few recalled Weller as strict, distant, but respected. Others remembered him differently, controlling, secretive, often staying late in the training fields alone. One former cadet claimed Weller had taken a particular interest in Lynn, though she couldn't say if it was professional or personal. That detail had never made it into the reports. At the time, such things weren't written down unless someone filed a complaint. Forensic testing on the remains revealed another chilling clue. The bones showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, a single, heavy impact delivered before death. The position of the remains and the condition of the soil suggested she had been placed there deliberately, not left by accident. Whoever hid her body had known that the barn was secluded and unlikely to be disturbed. As detectives reviewed the old case notes, frustration mounted. The original investigation had been a mess, disorganized, incomplete, missing key interviews. Several officers admitted off the record that they had been pressured not to dig too deeply into academy staff at the time. It was a man's world back then, one retired captain said quietly. You didn't question your own. The discovery of Lynn's remains forced everyone to confront that history. The state ordered a full internal review of the academy's 1977 operations, and the press descended on the town. Old rumors resurfaced, too, stories of secret relationships, academy hazing, and the cadet who supposedly saw Lynn speaking with a man in a blue pickup truck that night. But that man, it turned out, may have been Charles Weller. He had driven a blue Ford F-100, the same model described in the witness statement that had once been dismissed as unreliable. Still, without living suspects, the investigation hit a painful wall. DNA testing was limited. Too much of the evidence had degraded in the fire. What remained was circumstantial, suggestive but not conclusive. The official report listed her death as homicide, perpetrator unknown. Yet among the detectives working the case, few doubted who had done it. For months after the discovery, the burned barn became an unofficial memorial site. Cadets from the new academy class would drive out at night, leaving flowers or police patches near the ruins. Some said they felt an eerie stillness there, not ghostly, but heavy, like the place itself remembered. The Carter family held a quiet service, burying what was left of Lynn beside her parents. And as the ashes cooled and the media frenzy faded, one haunting question lingered. If the fire hadn't started that night, how much longer would she have stayed hidden? The story that had gone silent for decades was awake again, and the answers everyone sensed were not finished revealing themselves. The discovery of Lynn Carter's remains in that burned-out barn didn't just reopen an old file. It tore open a wound that had never really healed. In the weeks following the fire, investigators from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation descended on the scene, determined to understand not only how Lynn died, but why her body had been hidden so close to the very place that was supposed to protect her. The barn was combed over inch by inch. They sifted through layers of charred debris, uncovering not just her remains, but small haunting details that painted a clearer picture of what might have happened that night in 1977. Among the ashes, they found the rusted outline of an old police-issue flashlight, half-melted but still bearing the Academy's engraving, a shattered radio antenna, and near the base of a collapsed beam, a single handcuff, one cuff closed, the other hanging open. The hinge had been warped by heat, but when investigators compared its make and model, it matched the kind issued to instructors in the late 70s, not cadets. It was the first tangible sign that Lynn's death may have involved someone from within the Academy. They reconstructed the final hours of her life as best they could. On the night she vanished, heavy rain had been falling, washing away tracks and scents within minutes. She had likely been walking back from the training yard when someone offered her a ride, someone she trusted. The barn was less than 10 minutes away by truck. Inside, they found no signs of animal remains or stored equipment, suggesting it had already been cleared out before the fire. Investigators theorized it may have been used briefly, perhaps just once, to hide something that wasn't meant to be found. Forensic teams sent what remained of her uniform for lab testing. The fibers told their own story. Traces of soil embedded in the fabric didn't match the barn's ground composition. They came from a nearby creek bed, suggesting Lynn's body may have first been left outdoors before being moved. This small detail transformed the narrative entirely. Whoever killed her hadn't acted in panic. They had time. They had privacy. And they knew how to cover their tracks. In a quiet interview room in Columbus, Detective Elaine Morris, one of the new leads on the case, spent weeks combing through Weller's old personnel file. He'd been a decorated deputy for nearly 2 decades, known for his marksmanship and discipline. But tucked deep inside his record was a note from 1976, an informal complaint from a female cadet who accused him of unprofessional behavior during after-hours instruction. The case was never followed up, and the name of the complainant was redacted. But the timing fit. It was the same training year Lynn had entered the program. The deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing the pattern became. Weller had been known to conduct one-on-one field assessments with female cadets, a practice that went unregulated at the time. When they spoke to his former peers, most described him as by the book. But one retired instructor, after much hesitation, recalled that Weller had been visibly shaken the week Lynn disappeared. He had shown up late to a meeting, drenched from the storm, claiming he'd been out searching the training fields after hearing something strange. When pressed for details, he brushed it off. That same night, according to the Academy's log, Weller signed out one of the utility trucks, a blue Ford pickup. No record exists of when he returned it. With each revelation, the story grew darker. Investigators now believed Lynn's disappearance wasn't a random act, but something personal, possibly a confrontation that turned violent. The skull fracture confirmed a single, precise blow, consistent with a blunt instrument like a flashlight or baton. The absence of any defensive wounds suggested she was caught off guard. She might have trusted the person who approached her. Maybe she even thought they were helping her get out of the storm. In the months following the discovery, local media revisited the story relentlessly. Old Academy photos circulated on television. Former cadets came forward with long-suppressed stories, whispers of misconduct, hidden relationships, instructors who crossed lines. The Academy released a public statement expressing deep regret for historical failures and oversight. For Lynn's brother, Daniel Carter, those words meant little. He told one reporter, "They treated her like a ghost when she went missing. Now they act like they care because her bones made the news." Daniel pushed for answers the system still couldn't give him. He hired a private investigator, hoping to trace anyone who had known Deputy Weller outside of the Academy. That search uncovered one final thread. Before leaving Ohio in 1978, Weller had sold his property, including the barn, to a friend named Paul Dwyer, another former deputy. Dwyer told police that Weller had insisted on sealing off the back of the barn with new boards, claiming he was keeping raccoons out. Dwyer never thought much of it. When the property changed hands again in the 90s, that section remained untouched until the fire. The implication was staggering. The man responsible for Lynn's death had hidden her in plain sight, then watched as life moved on. Even as he retired, relocated, and died years later, the truth had stayed buried within his own land. By the summer of 2002, forensic labs completed their final analysis. Trace elements from the barn soil matched pollen samples taken from the uniform fibers, confirming Lynn's remains had been moved there shortly after her death, possibly within a day. There were faint residues of motor oil and hydraulic fluid on the bones, suggesting her body may have been transported in the bed of a vehicle that had been used for maintenance or training, likely one of the Academy's trucks. Detective Morris presented her findings to the county prosecutor. There would be no trial. Weller was long dead, and the evidence, while compelling, would never survive the courtroom scrutiny. But unofficially, the case was closed. The report listed the likely perpetrator as deceased. Cause of death: homicide by the blunt force trauma. The closure was hollow. There was no confession, no justice, just the faint echo of a story that had gone unsolved for too long. For the Academy, the discovery became a reckoning. Protocols changed, records were digitized, and an annual memorial was created in Lynn's name for missing law enforcement trainees. But within the community, the unease lingered, a sense that too many people had looked the other way. In the years that followed, the old barn site grew over with weeds. What remained of its foundation was fenced off, a small plaque marking where Lynn Carter was found. Every so often, new cadets would visit, leaving their badges or a single blue flower. Some said they did it to remember her sacrifice. Others did it because they couldn't shake the feeling that if they forgot her story, it might happen again. For Daniel Carter, the fire had ended one chapter but opened another. He often returned to Ohio, sitting in silence by his sister's grave. He once told a local paper that he didn't believe in coincidences, that maybe the storm, after all those years, had come for a reason. Maybe the lightning struck exactly where it needed to. And though the official investigation was over, some detectives couldn't let it go. Elaine Morris kept Lynn's file on her desk long after it was closed. She said she wasn't searching for evidence anymore, just understanding. She believed that if the barn hadn't burned that night, Lynn's story would have been lost forever. Sometimes, she said in an interview years later, justice doesn't arrive through people. It comes through time, through weather, through the things we can't control. In the end, that fire had revealed more than a skeleton. It exposed decades of silence, the kind that had protected reputations instead of victims. And though the man responsible would never face trial, his name became synonymous with betrayal in the Academy's history. Lynn's story was finally entered into the state homicide records. Her status changed from missing to found. What remained was the haunting question that no report could answer. How many others were never found because their stories never caught fire? The flames that destroyed the barn had done something that thousands of man-hours never could. They brought Lynn Carter home. But the truth, as everyone in that small Ohio town eventually learned, burns a lot longer than wood. As investigators began peeling back the layers of Deputy Charles Weller's past, the quiet relief that had come with solving Lynn Carter's case turned into something darker. The more they learned about him, the clearer it became that the story didn't end with one man's death. It reached far deeper into the walls of the institution that had once called him an instructor, a mentor, and a protector. Weller had been part of the Academy's backbone in the 1970s, a man the cadets were taught to respect, even fear. On the surface, he embodied discipline. But inside his personnel file, long buried under decades of dust, there were cracks, the kind that had been carefully plastered over by time and bureaucracy. One of those cracks was a series of internal memos marked confidential. They dated back to 1978, a year after Lynn vanished. Each described vague but troubling incidents, boundary violations, unprofessional conduct, unverified complaints from female trainees. The language was deliberately soft, designed to minimize what those words really meant. Weller was quietly transferred to administrative duties and told to take early retirement. By 1980, he was gone from the Academy completely. There was no record of any official inquiry, no disciplinary board, no criminal referral. It was as if someone had decided that the best way to solve a problem was simply to move it out of sight. Detective Elaine Morris stared at those memos for hours, the realization sinking in that Lynn's death hadn't just been overlooked, it had been protected. Someone back then had known enough to act, but not enough to risk the Academy's reputation. The silence hadn't been accidental, it had been institutional. They drove out to Tennessee to what remained of Weller's final home, a decaying farmhouse his family had sold after his death in 1995. The current owners gave permission to search the property, curious but uneasy about the attention. Behind the house was an old shed that had once stored his tools and hunting gear. Inside, the air was heavy with mildew and rust. When investigators lifted the floorboards, they found a shallow pit dry, compacted soil covered by a thin layer of gravel. Beneath it lay several corroded objects, an old Academy badge, a few torn photographs, and a small leather-bound journal wrapped in cloth. The badge, though oxidized, still carried the faint engraving of the Police Academy's emblem. It had been intentionally scratched across the front, as though someone had tried to erase its identity. The photographs were worse, fragments of group shots from the mid-1970s, showing cadets standing in formation. Lynn's face appeared in two of them, smiling, confident, unaware. Her image had been violently torn out from one photo and burned at the edges in another. Someone had fixated on her long after she was gone. But it was the journal that chilled investigators the most. Its pages were filled with meticulous, almost obsessive writing, scattered notes about training philosophies, obedience, and purity of service. The entries blurred the line between discipline and domination. One passage, dated the week before Lynn's disappearance, read, "There are those who test the order. Defiance must be shaped or removed." Another, written months later, said simply, "Peace restored. No one asks now." Psychologists who review the journal describe it as the work of a man consumed by control, someone who believed his authority was not just institutional but moral. It was a disturbing glimpse into the mindset of a predator who had operated under the cover of structure and uniformity. Detectives pieced together a theory of what happened that night. Lynn had been a standout cadet, bright, assertive, and unafraid to challenge authority. Weeks before her disappearance, she had reportedly confronted Weller during a training session, questioning his outdated and demeaning comments about female recruits. That confrontation, according to one retired cadet, had embarrassed him in front of others. In a rigid, male-dominated environment, humiliation could be deadly. Investigators believed Weller had used his position to lure her into a private evaluation, something he had done before under the guise of mentorship or discipline. The barn he chose was secluded, a place no one questioned him being near. That night, under heavy rain, Lynn likely followed him, unaware she was walking toward her own end. Forensic experts reviewing her injuries confirmed she'd been struck once, hard enough to cause immediate incapacitation. There was no sign of prolonged struggle. She hadn't even had time to cry out. The rest, investigators could only reconstruct through the evidence left behind. The crawl space beneath the barn, once used for feed storage, had been sealed with a layer of concrete poured unevenly across the floor. Chemical analysis of the residue confirmed the mixture dated to the late 1970s. Weller had likely returned after the storm passed, covering her body in soil and lime before sealing the space permanently. Over the decades, as the barn decayed, the foundation weakened. The fire, by sheer coincidence, had burned through that very section, exposing what had been hidden all along. When these findings were presented to the Academy Board, the reaction was tense and divided. Some expressed genuine remorse. Others defended the past by calling it a different time. But for the Carter family, those words rang hollow. Lynn's brother demanded to know why no one had spoken up, why her disappearance had been treated like a personal issue instead of a crime. There were no answers that could undo 25 years of silence. The investigation also uncovered another unsettling truth. Weller hadn't been entirely isolated. Old correspondence suggested that at least one superior officer had been aware of the complaints, but had intervened to protect the department's image. Whether that officer had any idea of the danger Lynn faced was impossible to prove, but his name appeared in archived memos approving Weller's transfer and early retirement. It was a quiet bureaucratic decision that had erased the trail of a killer. As the case file neared completion, Detective Morris found herself haunted by the contrast between Lynn and her instructor. Lynn had entered the academy to prove herself, to carve a place in a world that often told women they didn't belong there. She was driven by idealism, by the belief that wearing the badge meant standing for something good. Weller, on the other hand, had seen that same badge as a weapon, a tool to enforce submission, not justice. Their lives collided in the most tragic way possible, one driven by purpose, the other by power. The story spread beyond Ohio, picked up by national media outlets as a symbol of institutional neglect. The Academy issued a public apology, promising reform, but for many, it was too late. Lynn's death became a case study in every police ethics seminar across the state, a reminder of what happens when authority goes unchecked and complaints go unheard. But even as her story gained attention, one question remained unanswered. How had Weller managed to hide his crime so completely? The answer, investigators realized, lay in the culture of the time, a culture that rewarded silence, that taught cadets never to question their superiors. The system had protected him because he embodied its values, not because he broke them. And in doing so, it had condemned Lynn to vanish without a trace. By the end of the year, the case was officially closed again. There would be no charges, no trial, only a quiet press conference where the sheriff summarized the findings. Standing in front of microphones, he said, "We believe we know what happened." And though the man responsible can't be brought to justice, the truth, finally, has come to light. But for Detective Morris, that truth was cold comfort. She often replayed Lynn's story in her mind, the rain, the folded jacket on the park bench, the years of silence. What haunted her most wasn't just what had happened to Lynn, but how easily it had been allowed to happen. She once told a reporter, "We didn't just find her in that barn. We found our own failure buried with her." In the end, the fire that exposed Lynn's skeleton did more than uncover a crime. It stripped bare an entire system that had chosen to look away. The Academy built a memorial on the site, a small bronze plaque etched with her name, her Academy number, and a simple inscription: "She served with courage." Visitors still leave flowers there. Some say the place feels heavy, as though the ground itself remembers. But to those who know the full story, that weight is not haunting. It's history, pressing down with the force of all that was hidden and finally brought into the light. And somewhere in the background of that small Ohio town, the echoes of that night in 1977 still linger. The sound of rain against the roof of a barn, the creak of a door that no one thought to open, and the silence of a voice that deserved to be heard. Detectives spent the next several months unearthing everything they could about Deputy Charles Weller. It was like peeling layers off something that had been festering for decades, each new discovery darker than the last. They started with his file at the Academy, which was surprisingly thin. There were standard commendations, training evaluations, and transfer paperwork, but hidden deep in a supplemental folder were 3 disciplinary memos dated between 1978 and 1980. The language was formal, distant, almost sanitized. Boundary concerns, unprofessional conduct, improper one-on-one evaluation. But behind those bland words, former cadets remembered something much more sinister. A few of them, now in their 40s and 50s, agreed to speak with investigators. Their memories weren't perfect after all that time, but their stories aligned too cleanly to ignore. They recalled how Weller used his authority like a weapon. He found reasons to keep young women after hours, insisting they needed extra discipline or private guidance. Some described being cornered in hallways or alone in training sheds, feeling his breath too close, his tone changing from instructive to controlling. Nothing was ever documented, because back then, accusing a senior officer could end a career before it even started. So the whispers remained just that, whispers. By 1980, the Academy's leadership had a problem they didn't want to acknowledge. They couldn't prove anything against Weller, but they couldn't risk the rumors spreading either. So they quietly transferred him out of active training and into a desk role at the sheriff's office. A few months later, he retired early, citing health reasons. No one asked questions. No one wanted to. The culture of silence was stronger than any sense of justice. Now, sitting in an evidence room more than 20 years later, detectives sifted through boxes from Weller's estate. His death in 1995 meant there'd be no interrogation, no confrontation, just whatever secrets he'd left behind. Inside one storage crate, buried beneath old newspapers and a stack of receipts, they found something chilling, a small metal badge caked with rust and dirt. The number engraved on it matched Lynn Carter's Academy identification tag, the one recorded as missing from her effects. Next to it were fragments of photographs, torn training shots showing groups of cadets in formation. Lynn appeared in one, standing tall, her expression proud and focused. But the picture had been ripped in half, right through her face. When they finally reached the last box, detectives discovered a journal wrapped in a piece of canvas. The pages were warped with age, the ink smudged by time and moisture. Inside, Weller's handwriting was rigid and deliberate, like someone fighting for control. The entries weren't the daily reflections of an aging officer. They were something else entirely. Obsessions. Rants about obedience, temptation, and purity of the badge. He wrote about how the Academy had become corrupted by softness, how certain cadets forget their place. One entry, dated October 1977, the very week Lynn disappeared, mentioned a lesson given after lights out and atonement beneath the field. Forensic analysts combed through every word. They couldn't prove it was a confession, but the implications were undeniable. The phrasing, the timing, the buried artifacts, all pointed toward Weller. And as investigators retraced the night Lynn vanished, the puzzle began to form a horrifying picture. On the evening of her disappearance, heavy rain had flooded the Academy's training grounds. Lynn had finished her drills late, still dressed in her cadet uniform. Her roommate remembered she was planning to stop by the instructor's office to discuss her upcoming evaluation, a private session Weller himself had scheduled. Records from that week confirmed it. That meeting was supposed to take place in one of the barns used for tactical training, the same structure that decades later burned to the ground. Investigators theorized that Lynn met Weller there, believing it was a legitimate evaluation. He may have told her it was a disciplinary issue, perhaps about her lateness or about the argument she'd recently had with her fiancé, personal details he could have learned from casual conversation. Once she entered the barn, the storm outside would have drowned out any noise. The next morning, the only trace of her was her folded jacket found miles away, a diversion meant to confuse. Forensic teams revisited the burned remains of that barn. Beneath the spot where Lynn's skeleton had been discovered, they found traces of old concrete and lime, an unusual combination for flooring in a structure like that. Experts concluded that someone had poured a patch of concrete decades earlier, sealing something underneath. When the barn decayed and the fire later weakened the structure, the slab cracked open, exposing what had been hidden below for nearly a quarter-century. Detectives couldn't determine whether Weller had acted alone or if others had helped him conceal what happened. But circumstantial evidence suggested at least some level of institutional awareness. Paperwork showing his sudden transfer just weeks after the initial investigation. The lack of any documented interviews with Weller back in 1977. The Academy's insistence that Lynn had simply run off. It all hinted at a quiet, deliberate effort to avoid scandal, to protect a reputation rather than seek the truth. Reporters who revisited the story in the early 2000s described it as an open wound in uniform. The town, once proud of its academy, now viewed it with unease. Many of Weller's old colleagues refused to speak publicly. Others admitted, in vague tones, that something wasn't right back then. Even the sheriff at the time of Lynn's disappearance issued a short statement saying only mistakes were made. In the Carter family's hometown, the discovery brought mixed emotions. Lynn's younger brother, now in his 40s, said the confirmation of her fate didn't feel like closure, only the end of a very long nightmare. They found her, he told one interviewer. But they didn't really find the truth. They just found where they buried it. Investigators continued combing through Weller's life, searching for any other missing cadets, complaints, or unexplained resignations during his tenure. They found 2 cases of young women who abruptly quit the program within weeks of each other, both citing personal reasons. One had moved out of state and refused to speak to police. The other passed away years earlier in an unrelated accident. Their files showed eerily similar reprimands from Weller, vague notes about attitude correction and insubordination. It was as if he developed a system, a way to target and control anyone he saw as disobedient. The more detectives uncovered, the more they felt the weight of time pressing down on them. Evidence had rotted, witnesses had died, and those who remained were haunted by uncertainty. The journal entries, though incriminating, weren't enough for formal charges against anyone who might have aided the cover-up. The case became a brutal example of how silence can outlive guilt. Yet one detail from the journal stuck with them, a single line written near the end of Weller's life. "The light still burns beyond the fields," it read. Investigators wondered if it referred to the same mysterious barn light that retired Officer Harold Sloan had seen the night Lynn vanished, a light no one ever followed. It was almost as if Weller had been taunting them from beyond the grave, confirming that what Sloan saw was real, but leaving them no way to prove it. When the final report was filed, it ran more than 200 pages, a lifetime of secrets compressed into paper. The official conclusion read, "Death ruled as homicide. Suspect deceased." But for those who had lived through the mystery, the officers, the classmates, the family, the case didn't feel solved. It felt exposed, raw, and unfinished. In the years that followed, the story of Lynn Carter became a cautionary tale across law enforcement circles, not just about a crime, but about what happens when truth is buried too long. For many, the horror wasn't only in what Charles Weller did. It was in how easily everyone allowed it to fade from memory. And even now, decades later, some locals say that when storms roll over the old academy grounds, a faint glow can still be seen deep beyond the fields, right where that barn once stood, a symbol of a secret that refused to stay hidden. By the spring of 2003, the air around the old police academy felt different. The scandal that had once been whispered about in corners now lived openly in headlines and memorial speeches. For the first time in 25 years, Lynn Carter's name was spoken without hesitation, no longer as a mystery, but as a person whose life had been stolen and buried in silence. Her remains, after months of forensic review, were released to her surviving family, what little of them remained. The funeral was quiet, intimate, and heartbreakingly overdue. The town cemetery sat on a small rise overlooking the valley. The grass was uneven, and the headstones tilted slightly with age. Yet on that gray morning, it looked solemn and proud, a place that had been waiting for her. The procession moved slowly. A few dozen people gathered, some who had known Lynn, others who only knew her story. Former classmates who were now retired officers stood beside young recruits in crisp uniforms. The academy had sent an honor guard, 5 female cadets chosen from the top of their class, to carry her ashes and the folded academy flag that had once hung in the training hall. As they marched, their boots pressed softly into the damp earth, each step synchronized, deliberate, and reverent. The wind tugged at their collars, and a light drizzle began to fall, the same kind of rain that had followed Lynn on the night she vanished. When the urn was lowered beside the graves of her parents, silence fell. For years, those graves had been a symbol of unfinished grief. Her mother and father had died still hoping for answers, their headstones etched with a simple inscription, waiting for light. Now that waiting had ended, but the light that arrived was not the one they'd prayed for. In the months leading up to the burial, the final investigation into the case had concluded. What it uncovered was damning. Internal memos, buried deep within county archives, confirmed what many had long suspected. Senior academy officials had been aware of complaints against Deputy Charles Weller. In 1977, just weeks before Lynn disappeared, one memo warned of ongoing behavioral concerns and potential misconduct of a personal nature. Another, stamped confidential, recommended reassignment, pending further review. But that review never happened. Instead, the Academy's leadership had decided that transferring Weller quietly was in the best interest of departmental integrity. They had chosen reputation over truth. When these findings became public, outrage spread quickly. Local news stations covered the story daily, not as a cold case solved, but as a decades-long betrayal. Families of former cadets came forward with stories of being ignored, dismissed, or shamed when they raised concerns about instructors. Community meetings turned into emotional gatherings where residents demanded accountability. The sheriff's office issued a formal apology, though for many, it was too late to mean anything. The state attorney's office initiated a review of how the original investigation had been handled. Several retired officials were named in the report, not for direct involvement in the crime, but for what it called institutional negligence, the willful suppression of credible leads to avoid scandal. None faced charges due to the statute of limitations, but their reputations were permanently stained. The aftermath of Lynn's case didn't end with punishment, though. It led to change. In 2004, Ohio passed a series of reforms requiring that any allegations of harassment or misconduct within law enforcement training programs be immediately reported to an independent state oversight board. It also mandated that all missing persons reports involving academy personnel trigger an external review. It was, officials said, Lynn's legacy in law. Her story had become the catalyst for safeguards meant to ensure no one would disappear so easily again. At the academy, now operating under new leadership, they held a memorial service that spring. The courtyard where Lynn once trained had been refurbished, the cracked pavement replaced with new concrete. In its center stood a bronze plaque, simple but powerful. In honor of Cadet Lynn Carter, 1955 to 1977. Her courage endures. The ceremony was not grand or televised. It was quiet, reflective. Dozens of young women in uniform stood at attention as the director spoke softly about integrity, courage, and the cost of silence. The sound of rain tapping against their caps echoed through the courtyard. Each cadet wore a small black ribbon on their sleeve. And when the director called for a moment of silence, many couldn't help but look toward the distant tree line, where, decades ago, a single barn light had glowed in the storm. Among the attendees was retired officer Harold Sloan, the man who had once seen that light and never been able to forget it. His hair was white now, his shoulders stooped, but he stood straight when they lowered their heads. Later, when asked why he came, he simply said, "Because I should have gone there that night." The fire that had revealed Lynn's remains was long extinguished, but the land where it burned still drew people in. Reporters, curious locals, and even some cadets visited over the years, though there was little to see. The barn had been cleared away. Only a rectangular patch of uneven soil remained, surrounded by wild grass and fragments of charred timber. Nature had reclaimed it, softening the edges of what had once been a crime scene. In summer, wildflowers grew there. In winter, snow covered it completely, erasing every trace. When investigators revisited the site one last time before closing the case for good, they found something unexpected, a single metal hinge half buried in the dirt. It likely belonged to the barn door that once sealed the crawl space where Lynn's body had been hidden. They left it there, deciding it belonged to the ground now, not to evidence. The final report summarized everything in stark language. Lynn Carter, age 22. Homicide victim. Perpetrator deceased. Institutional negligence confirmed. It was a conclusion without comfort, a truth that brought peace but no joy. Justice had arrived, but it was 25 years too late, and only by accident. Had that storm not sparked a fire, had firefighters not combed through the ashes so carefully, her story might still be buried under that concrete slab. Those who told her story in documentaries and news specials often ended with the same thought, that sometimes justice doesn't roar into existence. Sometimes it flickers quietly, like a match in the dark, igniting only when fate decides the timing. Lynn's story was one of those rare moments where the truth, though late, refused to die. Years later, visitors who came to the Academy Memorial would sometimes stop by the barn site. Locals said that at dusk, when the sun dipped low and the light turned silver, the fields beyond the Academy glowed faintly. Not bright, not supernatural, just the glint of sunlight on the remaining metal, like a memory refusing to fade. To most, it was just reflection. But to those who knew the story, it was something more. A quiet reminder that silence, no matter how long it lasts, can never fully bury the truth. The Academy still trains cadets every year. Young men and women march the same grounds where Lynn once did, their steps echoing across the fields. Most of them weren't alive when she vanished, but her story is part of their orientation, a lesson, a warning, and a vow. They're told about courage, integrity, and what it means to speak up even when it's hard. And as the voice of the director carries across the courtyard, the wind rustles through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of rain begins again, soft, steady, and familiar. It falls over the Academy, the graves, and the overgrown field beyond, where a fire once revealed the truth that everyone had tried to forget. Lynn Carter's name, once lost to silence, now lives on every year when the cadets march in her honor, their badges gleaming beneath the same gray sky she once walked under. The sound of their footsteps fades into the wind, leaving behind one lasting truth: justice, however delayed, still burns. And sometimes, it takes a spark to wake the world from its silence.